For decades, France believed Africa would never dare to say no. It believed the continent would always sign whatever and contract was placed in front of it, no matter how unfair, no matter how humiliating, because that was the way the world had always worked. But today, everything changed. A $500 billion uranium deal, the backbone of France's energy empire and the pride of Europe's power grid, has just been rejected by Africa with no hesitation, no apology, and no second thoughts.
Breaking news! A storm is shaking Europe tonight. France, once proud of its global dominance, is now on its knees after being forced to shut down several nuclear plants. The reason? No more free uranium from Africa. For decades, France had been feeding its power from Niger's uranium mines, exploiting Africa's resources while giving back nothing but poverty and suffering. The company at the center of it all, Urano, was making billions while Africa got crumbs.
The world didn't see this coming, not because Africa was incapable, but because nobody imagined Africa would finally decide it didn't need to obey in one historic move. Africa didn't just walk away from France, it shattered the foundation of European energy certainty. And France thought it owned the uranium supply that powers its nuclear plants. It thought Africa would remain dependent, silent, and grateful, but this time the continent chose itself. And it chose its people, it chose its future.
Breaking news, major energy crisis unfolding in France. France is facing a significant crisis following the recent shift in relations with several African nations, particularly those that have historically supplied it with essential minerals. In a dramatic turn of events, France has shut down 4 of its nuclear power plants. According to reports from CNN, the closures are due to overheating issues, but the deeper concern appears to be linked to a shortage of uranium, a key resource used in nuclear energy production. This shortage comes in the wake of France's expulsion from Niger, one of its primary sources of uranium.
Global markets are shaking, Paris is panicking, and Europe is trying desperately to pretend everything is under control. But behind closed doors, officials know the truth. If Africa can reject France, the rest of the world can no longer take Africa's resources for granted. This isn't just a deal falling apart. This is the end of an era and the beginning of Africa's rise.
On my first point, energy and climate. Today, only 2% of global investments in clean energy go to Africa. This is sobering. This is very sobering, given Africa's immense potential as a clean energy powerhouse. Africa has the space, the wind, the sun, just to name a few.
They don't want Africa to be independent and self-sufficient. They want Africa to be beggars. They want to be able to control the African leadership so that they can continue to exploit, super exploit the resources of the country.
We need Africa to be impoverished because we need those raw materials and we need them dirt cheap. If Africa does do something different, I assure you living standards of all those in Europe and North America is going to fall.
The announcement echoed across global markets like a thunderclap. Africa had rejected France's proposed $500 billion uranium deal, a deal Paris had already celebrated as guaranteed. The rejection didn't just derail a contract, it shattered assumptions. For decades, France had believed that Africa, rich in minerals, yet bound by old diplomatic habits, would never refuse its offers. But this time was different. Something had changed. Africa was no longer negotiating from a position of need. It was negotiating from a position of power. The uranium fields in Africa were no ordinary resource. They powered France's nuclear reactors, military programs, and its identity as the European champion of nuclear energy. More than 70% of France's electricity depended on uranium, and most of that came from Africa. Paris had always expected loyalty and compliance. It assumed Africa would simply sign whatever was placed on the table, as it had for decades under the weight of colonial systems, global pressure, and dependency traps. But this time the continent delivered a message so direct that even the most optimistic officials in Paris couldn't de-spin it. Africa would not hand over the future in exchange for crumbs. The shock was instant. Energy analysts across Europe couldn't believe what they were seeing. France had promised Western partners a guaranteed uranium supply for decades, presenting the Africa deal as an unbreakable foundation of European stability. It was more than a business contract, it was the lifeline of France's power grid and a key pillar of the European Unionist energy autonomy, and now it was gone. Paris scrambled to understand what had pushed Africa to say no, but the answer was hiding in plain sight. Africa had awakened to its value, the days of signing deals structured to benefit foreign nations more than its own people were fading. Markets reacted in seconds. French energy stocks plunged. European media desperately tried to reassure citizens that alternative uranium sources could be found, but industry experts knew the truth: Africa was the primary supplier. Mining projects elsewhere were costly, unstable, and insufficient. Europe had placed all its bets on Africa and had now lost the hand. As panic built in Paris, something else was happening across African nations. Pride. The uranium that once left the continent to illuminate European cities would now be redirected to African energy grids, African innovation, African industry. The same element that had built France's modern identity was about to build Africa's future. The response in Europe turned quickly from disbelief to anger. Media across the continent painted Africa's decision as reckless, threatening, and anti-cooperation, but Africa remained silent. There was no follow-up statement, no apology tour, no explanation, no press conference. The continent's silence said more than any speech. It showed confidence. It showed sovereignty. France began lobbying allies to pressure Africa diplomatically, but this time the strategy wasn't working. Asia supported Africa's right to negotiate its resources independently. Middle Eastern nations publicly expressed interest in new strategic partnerships. Even Latin American nations applauded Africa's economic stance, recognizing a historic moment when one region of the world broke free from the shadow of long-standing influence. What terrified France the most wasn't the uranium itself, it was the example. If Africa could reject a $500 billion offer from a European power, what would stop the continent from rewriting every major contract tied to European industry? Oil, diamonds, cobalt, gas, copper, lithium, resources crucial for the future of global technology, most of them rested within African borders. France could not afford for this rejection to spark a chain reaction, but that chain reaction was already beginning. Other African nations quietly began reviewing their extraction agreements with Western governments. Countries that had once been told they had no bargaining power suddenly realized they held the keys to the next industrial revolution. If uranium could be leveraged, so could rare earth minerals. If Europe needed Africa more than Africa needed Europe, then the continent was finally holding the stronger position. France sent urgent envoys to reopen diplomatic negotiations, offering concessions, contracts, aid packages, tourism incentives, anything to revive the uranium agreement. Yet every attempt was met with the same response. Africa was not interested. It wasn't about the money. It wasn't about rivalry. It was about independence inside France. Tension rose. Citizens began asking why their country had built its energy system around a resource it did not control, and worse, around a region that Paris had taken for granted for decades. Politicians avoided the question. Energy officials tried to calm markets, but the truth was unavoidable. France's future depended on a continent that no longer followed its direction. The uranium rejection turned into the most powerful geopolitical wake-up call in Europe's recent history, and what countless analysts failed to understand was that this shift didn't come from aggression, it came from confidence. Africa wasn't trying to crash France. Africa was trying to build Africa. The crash was simply unavoidable, because the old world was not designed to allow the continent to rise. And as Europe struggled to contain the fallout, Africa began to prepare for something bigger, a future where its resources didn't leave for pennies, but stayed to power cities, industries, technology, and progress across the continent. The $500 billion deal wasn't the end, it was the beginning. The shockwave that began with the uranium rejection didn't fade with time, it intensified. While France struggled to contain domestic panic, Africa began laying the foundation of a new direction that would no longer be shaped by Western approval. Instead of retreating under pressure as France expected, the continent doubled down on its vision. Africa announced the creation of a new regional energy consortium that would manage uranium, cobalt, lithium, and other minerals as strategic development assets rather than export commodities. The announcement sent a message louder than any speech. Africa was no longer waiting for outside investors to determine the value of its resources. Rather than shipping raw uranium to Europe, the continent planned to refine and process the material domestically, generating thousands of jobs and enabling Africa-controlled nuclear energy and technology advancement. For decades, critics claimed Africa lacked the capacity to manage such a transition, but this time the continent wasn't asking for permission or validation. It was building its own capacity, step by step, partnership by partnership, led not by dependency but by strategy. France quietly hoped the new consortium was just political theater, but when Africa signed new trade and technology agreements with Asia and the Middle East, hopes in Paris began to crumble. These agreements were not extractive contracts. They were partnerships based on investment in Africa's industrial development, from mining equipment, manufacturing to nuclear research labs to local processing facilities. The continent that used to export raw minerals was preparing to become the world's new center of energy-driven industry. Inside Europe, unease grew rapidly. Many nations privately admitted they were reliant on France's nuclear power leadership, which in turn relied on Africa's uranium supply. If France lost control of that supply, Europe risked losing control of an entire energy pillar, yet none of the European governments were willing to admit that dependence publicly. Instead, they framed Africa's shift as risky, insisting that the continent was turning away from partnership and stability. But Africa's citizens didn't buy that narrative. For them, this was the first time in modern history that the continent was choosing itself. The more Europe criticized, the more Africa's unity strengthened. Countries that once saw themselves as competitors began seeing themselves as allies in a shared pursuit of sovereignty. Leaders who once accepted foreign contracts without negotiation were now calling for transparency and fairness. Major African universities launched academic programs focused on nuclear engineering, geology, and energy economics. Youth organizations celebrated the uranium decision as proof that Africa could shape the world economy instead of merely supplying it. Meanwhile, France was losing more than a contract. It was losing its identity as the unchallenged architect of energy policy in Europe. Politicians avoided mentioning the uranium crisis publicly, but every policy meeting, every diplomatic call, every cabinet conversation circled around the same fear: if France couldn't secure uranium from Africa, its nuclear-based energy system could collapse, and if that system collapsed, Europe's stability could fracture. Desperation pushed France to try a final, aggressive maneuver. Paris attempted to negotiate individually with separate African nations, bypassing the new continental consortium. Historically, this tactic had worked to divide Africa politically, secure bilateral deals quietly, and neutralize continental bargaining power. But when the attempt leaked, something unprecedented happened. African nations closed ranks instead of breaking apart. Not one African government agreed to engage behind the consortium's back. That moment, more than the rejection itself, terrified France. It meant Africa was no longer a fragmented patchwork of economies competing for investor attention. It meant Africa was behaving like a unified power bloc. Western analysts, once confident that African cooperation would fail due to internal differences, suddenly had to confront a new reality: the continent was learning to leverage unity. France switched tactics again and tried to rally Western allies to threaten sanctions, embargoes, or trade restrictions, but Washington remained silent, unwilling to damage its growing economic ties with Africa. London avoided involvement, concerned about its own energy vulnerabilities. Even Brussels refused to escalate beyond diplomatic statements, fearful of driving Africa further toward Asia and the Middle East. For decades, the West assumed Africa had everything to lose. Now they were realizing Africa had options, and while Europe struggled, Africa continued to move forward. Plans for nuclear reactors built on African soil progressed rapidly. African nations worked together to develop uranium pricing standards that would prevent lowball purchases. Digital platforms were created to track extraction and export routes in real time, eliminating the secretive loopholes used for decades to siphon profits out of the continent. Economic analysts across the world admitted it openly. Africa was reinventing the rules of resource economics. France watched helplessly as the consortium announced a landmark policy: uranium exports would no longer be used to support foreign energy dominance while leaving the continent without electricity. A portion of all production would now be dedicated to powering Africa first. Europe, which once assumed Africa would always export raw materials without question, found itself on the outside of a new economic system. In global financial markets, investors noticed the shift before politicians did. Western corporations were forced to rethink their strategies as new African investment opportunities flourished not in extraction but in manufacturing and technology. For the first time in modern history, Africa was becoming not just a supplier of minerals but a destination for advanced industry. International banks quietly recalculated long-term projections, and something extraordinary happened. Africa's economic growth trajectory began to surpass Europe's. The uranium decision was no longer just a political crisis for France. It was the moment the world realized Africa was stepping into an era of self-directed development. The old colonial economic structure built on dependency, exploitation, and control had been permanently disrupted. France's officials hoped the momentum would fade with time, but they were wrong. Every month, Africa announced another milestone: new infrastructure, new research programs, new regional trade policies, new industrial facilities, all funded by African resources, generating African wealth. The world was witnessing the birth of a new power center, and the country that once shaped the destiny of Africa now found itself shaped by Africa's decisions. The message was undeniable. Africa wasn't fighting for recognition. Africa wasn't seeking permission. Africa was taking ownership, and France, once confident that the continent would forever be its economic pillar, was now forced to face a reality it never prepared for: a world where Africa controls its own future and where Europe must adapt rather than command. The energy landscape had changed, the balance of power had changed, and there was no going back.